Good morning, everybody. My name is Alfonso Del Bercio. I'm in charge of Block 3. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks together talking about discourse. So this is Block 3. We are going to introduce a new kind of macro theme that will kind of help us complexify what and advance the knowledge that we have acquired so far. So while so far we have looked at discourse in a way in everyday practices, how people speak, and how this speaking is informed by registers, scripts, and cultural knowledge and cultural understanding of language and society. In Block 3, we are starting to think more about how discourse intersects and is related with inequality, politics, economy, and the history. So we are going to start this reflection by looking at these 3 chapters from the book of Monica Heller and Bonnie Michelini. We have asked you to look at the preface, the introduction, and chapter 6. So what is this book about, right? You're going to probably ask yourself, what is this book about? And well, I think this book tries to write the history of the language studies, right? So in a way, it is an introspective thinking about how language scholars have produced knowledge about language in the last 500 years. In a way, so if we think about the notion of diversity that we discussed last week, in this book, what they are doing is to track the notion of language through history, right? So looking at tracking the changing understandings of language in the social sciences throughout the last 500 years. Of course, this book is written by 2 scholars located in North America, so they are going to look at this history from a very specific positionality, namely their own, right? So they will tell this history from somebody mainly interested in what's going on in the US and the way kind of scholars more or less linked to US academia have been thinking about language. But I do think that it's still very relevant because the processes and actors that they are documenting are also very much linked to what we do in the UK. So, what is also interesting is in this book is that they understand their analysis as what they call this walking back into the future, namely the idea to look at to trace back the notion that the concept of language and the way language has been discussed and theorized in past in order to imagine an alternative future. So this book, it's not just an intellectual exercise, but an attempt to imagine language in a different way for a better society. So it's both an intellectual exercise and in a way a political and a utopian project. So my lecture today is going to be structured in 3 parts. I'm going to first present the main arguments of the book, and especially of the 3 chapters that we have read, and then try to think with you in a second part about what discourse is here. So what can we learn from this book about the way we should or could conceptualize discourse, okay? And then in the third part, I'm gonna think with you about what this book is telling us about the way discourse should be analyzed, right? So I do think that it's relatively quite useful for the discussions that you have had so far with Miguel and Juan. So let's focus first on in this first part on the main arguments. So what is the main argument of this book and of the 3 chapters that I've asked you to read? So the main argument for me is the idea that knowledge, and knowledge about language in particular, is not something objective, right? So it's not something that is out there, that is independent from any social process. But what we have come to know about language, what we teach you about language in our classes and in the other modules of these programs, is linked with political and economic processes. This knowledge has served both the, has served agendas of war, politics, and economic development. Serves now and has served in history. At the same time, this knowledge about language has also served the contestation of these political projects. So it's both at the service of violence and oppression and economic development, and at the same time, it is meant to help the contestation of these processes. So what we have, so this is the first kind of the main argument. So we can't think the discipline of applied linguistics, without thinking about larger political processes, about oppression and violence. So what we also have learned and seen is that the production of knowledge, so the way we as scholars of language think and the academic work that we do, cannot be seen in isolation. But throughout the 20th century, what it became clear is that the knowledge that was produced about language, the academic knowledge, was subjected to forms of surveillance and control, right? So what we can see is that these main thinkers, those individuals who we consider to be the founding fathers of our disciplines, Zelig, Roman Jakobson, Delheims, Noam Chomsky, really kind of central figures in our disciplines, that their work has been constantly subjected by surveillance and control of the FBI and the CIA in the US, okay? So academic work is not free and has never been free, okay? And as we can see, even those central figures that we consider to be kind of the big theoretical thinkers in our work have been constantly subjected to control and surveillance. This, of course, has massive effects on what people can and could say about language in their work, okay? It's clear that especially during the Cold War in the US, every sort of critique of capitalism, of race, gender, inequality, class, that language scholars have made was suppressed and silenced, okay? Thinkers of language who try to link language to social and forms of social critique were either silenced or fired or made or marginalized, okay? Both by state actors and in the community of actors themselves. So why was language so important? So why did these political actors and these apparatuses of security were so much concerned with scholars of language, and especially those scholars of language who considered themselves more politicized? So first, language has always been seen as very important for politics because it is a tool through which attitudes of people, the way people think, the way people see the world, can be affected. And it's through language that apparatuses of security and intelligence have, so it's language that these apparatuses have invested in order to consolidate the people's loyalty towards the state and towards capitalism. This is the first thing. The second aspect why language was considered so important is because it was seen as a tool to acquire knowledge about the enemy, right? So both the internal enemy, all these kind of groups of people who were considered to be deviant within the state, but also the external enemies, those external actors who were considered to affect the stability and security of a nation state. Okay, so a language was seen as a tool to understand the way people think, their cultural concepts, the way they produce logics, right? So and the way people behave and act. So, and the third, let's say, reason for which language and language scholars were considered so much important for the state and this security apparatus is that kind of controlling language and understanding language was also a mean of controlling the flow of information. Okay. So, in other words, language was considered to be so important because it allowed to both unmask ideology and at the same time produce and reproduce ideology and propaganda. So, controlling language thinkers, and making sure that language scholars would be at the service of the state was seen as an important tool both to manage and unmask kind of propaganda that was produced by the enemy, and at the same time produce propaganda by themselves. So the state interest in language and language thinkers and language academics such as us has throughout the 20th century has led to a rapid professionalization of the field. So a lot of money was put into these language disciplines, what then led to the creation of these fields the way we know them today: applied linguistics, communication studies, translation studies, linguistics itself, and these area studies like Latin American studies or Chinese studies or African studies, right? So the idea was that putting money into these disciplines allowed to kind of professionalize knowledge and professionalize knowledge production and use then this knowledge for the cause of capital and imperialism and other forms of kind of violence and of oppression. Okay? And of course, for the cause of the control and regulation of people in general. So it would be, of course, wrong to think that academics and academic knowledge production in our disciplines were fully constrained and fully under the control of the state apparatus and these apparatuses of security and intelligence. This was obviously not the case. Of course, we had a big group of scholars who were compliant with these institutions of power and who produced intentionally knowledge which served the interests of these institutions, right? But this was just one part of the scholarship in the language studies. We have a second part which is actually much more relevant and in a way also more interesting for what we are doing is given this kind of constraints that were put on scholars of language, what is interesting is that we see a number of scholars who, in order to avoid becoming kind of subjected to political regulation, state control, and control by state authorities, they started to think language as disconnected from the social. So as language as something that could be studied in itself without linking it to race, gender, class, the economy, and politics, right? So we see here the development of a body of knowledge, right? A discipline, if you want, that is required to think language in specific ways in order to avoid to be kind of subjected to state surveillance and state control, and also to be punished and stigmatized. Then we have a third group who, throughout history, persists with producing knowledge about language that is connected to race and class and gender and capitalism, right? So this knowledge has often also used in order to contest these larger political formations. But within these disciplines, what becomes clear, or what is clear, or what Monica Heller and Bonnie McKilley show well, is that these scholars are often stigmatized by both the state authorities and their colleagues, and often get punished, either get fired or get marginalized within their own disciplines. Okay, so these are the kind of three ways that scholars in the language studies have reacted to the way the state has attempted to gain control over the way language scholars have thought and conceptualized and theorized language. So, what is all this telling us about the way we could or should conceptualize discourse? What is discourse here? So what is clear is that the theory of discourse that they are trying to put forward in this book is in a way different from what we have seen so far. Here, discourse is understood as knowledge, in particular knowledge about language. So knowledge. So discourse are ideas about the world, about the social world that we inhabit, in this case about the social dimension of language, that circulate across space and time, right? And so this is the first aspect of this understanding of discourse. Discourse as knowledge, right? Knowledge that is produced by people, that gets circulated, that gets picked up, and then reproduced, and so that it circulates across space and time. What is also clear in this account proposed by Bonnie McKilley and Monica Heller is that discourse its production and circulation cannot be disconnected from the social, cultural, and economic and the political sphere. So the production and circulation of discourse cannot be analyzed as something separate from the social, but it goes hand in hand. Okay? Because as we have seen, the way scholars think and talk and write, knowledge about language, if you want, is intrinsically linked to the state apparatus and the apparatuses of surveillance and intelligence. There are no ways of dislinking them. Okay? So, Bonnie McKilley and Monica Heller give us three concepts to help us think and operationalize, if you want, the notion of discourse. So they ask us to look at discourse through these three concepts, namely keywords, hegemony, and ideology. So what are these keywords? The notion of keywords was coined by a scholar called Raymond Williams, who was interested in these concepts that emerge at a specific moment in history, that are filled with knowledge and or meaning, and that get to circulate across time and space, right? So these concepts that create discussion and debates and struggle, that they use to do things. So, for example, think about what we discussed last week, diversity, right? So diversity is one of these keywords, right? That emerges, that is brought into an institution by somebody, that creates discussion, that is picked up by somebody else, that is where there is an adding of meaning, and that allows to do things in an institution. So diversity is a keyword. Another of these keywords is obviously, as we see in this book, language. People talk about language, give it meaning, conceptualize language, try to do something with it. And this meaning then is taken up by other people and transformed. So again and again, and so that this this keyword is filled with knowledge that is transferred from space to space, from generation to generation, and can circulate across space and time. Okay. This knowledge is also often contested, right? So certain people fill it with specific knowledge, other people fill it with other knowledge, right? So there is struggle. So certain people try to link the notion of language with the social. Other people try to link the notion of, to dislink the notion of language with the social, right? So there is always struggle about how what kind of meaning should be filled into this kind of concept that in a way is empty, doesn't mean anything, right? Diversity, language. And of course, as we said, then once it gets filled with meaning, these concepts have effects, right? Understanding language in specific ways has effects for specific people, right? So the second notion that they offer us in order to better conceptualize the notion of discourse is the idea of hegemony. Okay, so there is this idea. So the concept of hegemony was coined by an Italian linguist called Antonio Gramsci, and this idea of hegemony, stands for this. You know what happens once one of these keywords and the knowledge that this keyword is attached with becomes hegemonic, that means becomes common sense, is not questioned anymore by anybody. When the idea that language is this and not something else becomes something that is shared on a societal level, it's not questioned. We call that hegemony. Okay. So again, think about the notion of a good speaker, right? A good speaker is somebody who speaks correct language. That's a good speaker, right? And automatically we have the assumption that a good speaker must be also a smart person. So when these two aspects, good speaker, three aspects, good speaker, correct language, and smart person becomes one thing and are not questioned anymore, we talk about, this idea becomes hegemonic. Or think about gender, the idea that women speak in specific ways, right? Or that women are necessarily subordinated to men. When these ideas become common sense, when they are not questions, when we even think that they are biological, right? So women are subordinated to men because it's nature that wants that. We talk about a hegemony. Or the last example could be the idea of race, right? Black people are less rational than white people, right? When such ideas become shared across societal strata, we talk about hegemony. Nobody questions them. Everybody thinks it's a natural status. We can't question them. It's the way it is. This is hegemony. So once a discourse becomes shared, a body of knowledge becomes shared on a societal level, we talk about hegemony. So the notion of hegemony in a way also implies in a way a notion of power, right? So we have two ways of conceptualizing power. Power can be understood as coercion, so in terms of violence. I exert power on somebody by exerting violence, but this is not hegemony. Hegemony functions through consent, right? Through persuasion. So the idea that things are persuasion legitimizes inequality and oppression and violence, and legitimizes whatever happens in this world by saying things are the way they are because they are natural and can't be changed, right? So people So people who are in power create alignment with their own projects by through consent, by arguing that things are the way they are because they are natural. Right? And at this point, it's that academic expertise becomes so important because often hegemony uses academic expertise to naturalize processes. Since we have this idea that academic expertise is not political but objective, we use it as a form of, in order to create consent, to explain things are the way they are. Listen at the experts, they know it's natural, right? We know that the native speaker is the one who speaks best English, right? It's because it's the native speaker. We have heard it from the experts, so we need to believe it. And that's gonna then justify relations of inequality between those who are considered native and those who are not. We know from biologists that actually there are gender differences and that women are less strong than men. So, this is the expertise that is out there, and we need to listen to these experts. And that's then justifying why there are relations of inequality between men and women, right? Consent. Power through consent. Okay, the third notion that Bonnie McLeany and Monica Heller are giving us in order to better understand how discourse works is the notion of ideology, right? So what's important here is to understand ideology here is not conceptualized in terms of false consciousness. So it's not understood in a Marxist sense. So it's not a fake news in a way, right? But ideology is something else. All bodies of knowledge can be ideological. All forms of expertise, including the ones that we produce as academics, can be ideology. They are ideological when they come to serve those groups of people who are in power. Okay, so they become ideological when they are mobilized intentionally in order to serve the interests of those who are in power. So academic knowledge about language can be ideological when it is appropriated by the state authorities to justify the interests of the state. Okay, so these three notions, keywords, hegemony and ideology, help us think the notion of discourse as knowledge. The way knowledge, so keywords helps us think about the way specific bodies of expertise, for example, about language, circulate across space and time. Hegemony helps us to think about how these kind of bodies of expertise become common sense and exert power. And ideology helps us think about how these bodies of knowledge who circulate across space and time become common sense, how they come to serve specific interests, namely the interests of those people who are in power. Okay, so in this last part now, I'm gonna reflect with you about what this book is telling us about how we should or could analyze discourse. Okay, what is clear is, the book is very clear, that this kind of tracking debates about language and the way language is tied or not to the social, how this tracking of language across space and time, that they call this kind of method, this method of tracking, they call it genealogy. Okay. Interestingly, this method here is opposed through the method that Sara Ahmed produced in the book that we discussed last week. Namely, she also does the tracking, but she tracks the notion of diversity across institutional sites. So she remains in the presence, and she looks at the way the notion of diversity circulates within institutional sites. Here we have another form of tracking. Namely, we take the notion of language as we know it now. I mean, you are attending an applied linguistic program, and you can, you see there are kind of different notions of language that circulate, that are here, right? kind of quite diverse actually. And then the way the tracking functions is to go back in history and look at how these different, where does these different notions of language come from. Okay, so we take as a starting point the present today and try to go back and see, okay, who has coined this notion of language and under what conditions? Who was this person? Why was this person interested in conceptualizing language in this way and not in another way? What was his or her political agenda? What were the social circumstances? And then they go back again. By whom was this person influenced? What did this person read? By whom was he or she trained? And again, what kind of political circumstances made that they produced this notion of language the way they did? So they go back in history, okay? So in a way, they are doing a social analysis or an ethnography of this field, look at who tells what stories of language at what moment in time, what other stories were there but were never foregrounded or became marginal. Okay, what stories were hegemonic, what stories were silenced, by whom were these stories picked up and in order to do what? And how did all this happen within a frame, within kind of these apparatuses, within a context which was framed by political and economic interests, within a context of knowledge production which was framed by apparatuses of security and intelligence. Right? So the way people produce knowledge is never separated by the world outside there, but happens within those worlds. So to tell the history of the discipline or to tell the history of this concept, to track this concept and think about how the circulation of this concept across history is always framed by what happens outside. Okay? So this is the kind of method that they propose. What kind of data do we need for that? It's clear what they work mainly with archival data. So they go in archives and see what do we know about people. What are these archives telling us about these scholars who thought and investigated language? To look at letters that they have written, reports that they have written, articles that they have written, to look at how they, engage with other scholars at conferences or in meetings or workshops. Okay, so that is one aspect. The other aspect is that they made interviews. I mean, when you study the more recent history, you can make interviews with actors who have lived that moment and who can tell you about that moment, right? They also look at, funding schemes. So who funded that research? What was the context of funding? What were these institutes, these research centers? Who funded these research centers? What were the power dynamics and power mechanisms in these research centers? And try to connect what was produced with the political agendas of these research centers and try to see whether there were connections and disconnections. Of course, in these studies, they also looked at these police reports and CIA and FBI reports and this kind of monitoring practices and what the state apparatus was saying about these language scholars to see how these things connected what they said about language and their kind of practice of surveillance of these knowledge producers. Okay, so archival data. Maybe a last thing before I finish. What is also important methodologically and analytically, and that which becomes evident, if you want, in the preface that I have asked you to read, is that Bonnie McLeany and Monica Heller don't consider their own discourse, because this book is a piece of discourse, right? Their own discursive production about language as disconnected from all this story, right? So the kind of second level of analysis that they suggest is to problematize their own positionality as co-producer of knowledge, to ask exactly the same questions, namely, what makes me tell the story about all this in the way I'm doing? What makes that I'm not telling the story? That means producing another type of discourse. uh, what makes that I'm producing exactly that type of discourse? What are the social, political, and historical conditions that make me think, conceptualize about language and the history of the language discipline in this way and not in another way? And in order to do that, we need to make a social analysis of ourselves and of our conditions of existing, of existing and thinking, right? So who are we? Why are we writing this? And what makes us writing this text in this way and not in another way? Okay? So the kind of analytical categories that we use in order to analyze the way this keyword language has circulated across time and space needs to be imposed onto ourselves and think at how and why do we continue telling this story about language, and what makes us telling this specific story instead of another. Okay. Yes, so should you have any questions regarding this text, please feel free to ask them in class or send me emails or ask your peers, and we will try all together to answer them. Thank you very much.